In moral philosophy, we tend to group specific ethical theories into larger families of ethical theories. These families are categorized by their moral concerns or goals. So for example, utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory, so it sits inside the family of ethical theories called consequentialism, and they're concerned with outcomes or creating better outcomes by our actions. Whereas deontology, which is the family of ethical theories where Kant's categorical imperative is more concerned with establishing moral rules or duties or obligations. Today, we're going to talk about a family of ethical theories called virtue ethics. Virtue ethics isn't concerned necessarily with the types of actions or specific moral rules. They're concerned with creating the good life, or how do we improve the human condition through positive living. This theory was brought forth by the Greeks, and most famously by Aristotle, who was a philosopher extraordinaire. He was a student of Plato, a teacher of Alexander the Great, and he studied everything from biology to logic to poetry to empiricism to ethics and so much more. He was a really prolific writer. He wrote tons of stuff, and he wrote a lot of ethical works, but his most famous is called the Nicomachean Ethics. And the Nicomachean Ethics is concerned with living the good life. So it's a virtue ethics type book. So he saw ethics as a practical philosophy aimed at doing and achieving good things. And he thought that morality was a lifestyle, and it required constant practice and a highly developed character. And he thought that with continued practice and the right characteristics, one could achieve what's called eudaimonia. And eudaimonia is a Greek word that has no real English translation, but roughly it translates to flourishing. So eudaimonia is the good life. In order to achieve eudaimonia, Aristotle thought that you needed phronesis and arete. Phronesis simply means practical wisdom, and arete means the virtues. And he thought that if you combine these two things, you could have the good life. So let's get into more of these Greek terms. What is arete? It's a Greek word that translates roughly to excellence or virtue in English. And Aristotle thought that if you had these virtues, you would have arete, which is one of the main components of achieving eudaimonia. So Aristotle thought that our character was made up of virtues and vices, and that these were deep-seated characteristics or traits that manifested in habitual action. So you couldn't be said to have a vice or a virtue just by one act. So for example, you couldn't be said to have the vice of drunkenness from having just one party over the weekend, and you couldn't be said to be generous or have the virtue of generosity by giving just once. So you had to manifest these traits in habitual action, so you had to do them over and over again. And eventually, after a long time, you would have a virtue or a vice in your character based on these habits. So because of that, they're not innate, so we're not born with them. They don't come naturally to us. We learn them and practice them over time. So Aristotle believed that the virtues were midpoints between two vices, one of excess and one of deficiency, and that if you found this midpoint in these virtues, you could achieve arete. So what does that look like? Well, we have excess on this side, and we have deficiency on this side. Excess just means that you have too much of something, whereas deficiency means that you don't have enough. And Aristotle thought that the virtues lied in a balance between these two vices. So if we take something that we know to be a virtue, such as courage, we would find that virtue on either side, or right in between two vices. So if we have too much courage, if we have an excess of courage, we would be said to be foolhardy. So somebody who is brave to a fault, meaning that they run into battle without an action plan, or just do things that we would say are reckless. We would say that they have too much courage, and that's a vice. On the other side of that, a vice of deficiency means that you don't have enough courage. So this would be cowardice. So somebody who lacks courage would be said to have the vice of cowardice. And this can be done for every virtue. So honesty, right? If you have a deficiency of honesty, you would be a liar. If you have too much honesty, maybe you lack tact. If you go on, there's a whole list of these, and Aristotle established a list of like 30 some odd characteristics, but you could do this for just about anything, or you could keep it very simple. But the point is that this is how he saw virtues. So somewhere in between a vice of excess and a vice of deficiency lied the virtues. And if you establish these virtues as habitual action and they became a part of your character, then you would be said to have arete. This all seems really appealing as a theory because we're concerned with living our best life, which what could be better than that? But there are some problems with it. First of all, Aristotle doesn't really explain phronesis in practice. So he calls it practical wisdom, and the idea is that if you have this phronesis, you can take your virtues and apply them into your real life. So virtues plus phronesis equals good moral action which would of course lead us to eudaimonia, or the good life. But the problem is that he doesn't really explain what that action guidance would be. So one of the big faults of this theory is that there is no real action guidance. So it says, yeah, establish these virtues, here's what a virtue is, and then combine it with phronesis and you'll have good moral actions, and then you'll have the good life. But he doesn't really explain what this phronesis looks like in the real world. And so we're kind of left to our own devices on that. And some may say that that's a very appealing part of the theory because then you get to essentially make it up for yourself and decide. But if we're looking to always do the right moral thing, sometimes having that guidance is really important, especially when we're first starting out. But he doesn't really give us that. But the main point to take away from this theory is that we are always trying to achieve eudaimonia, or the good life. Aristotle thought that the way to be a virtuous person was to achieve the good life. And what that took was phronesis, which is practical wisdom, and arete, which is that deep-rooted excellence or virtue of character. And if we could combine all those things in whatever way worked for us, somehow we would achieve moral goodness and by extension, live our best lives.